the job guarantee program from the point of view of my local council, and they would be delighted to employ people with a minimum wage, for instance, to clean up the parks, or if they're currently claiming they can't afford, they're asking for volunteers now to clean up the parks and things like that.
Right.
But they also want to take care of the elderly, and they need nurses and things like that. And those aren't minimum wage jobs, really. I mean, I don't think you expect. I mean, I don't like the idea of being taken care of by someone.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's more of a skill job.
Right,
so
absolutely.
That's another part of the story. And also climate change. I mean, yes, we want to build new batteries and things, but those aren't really minimum wage jobs. Those are, and so we like. So there's another part of the story. I mean, the JG would go so far into, yes, it supports the bottom.
Absolutely.
But if you want to tell the local council they want librarians, that's another one that they can't afford.
Right.
The JG isn't really going to do that for them. So there's another side to this in terms of
absolutely.
using the power of sovereign currency to go further in that sense.
I agree 100%. So if we need more nurses, if we need more doctors, if we need more teachers, these resources are producible, right? And how do we produce nurses and teachers? We can import them through immigration, or we can invest in education and produce those skilled resources. So the job guarantee is not designed to be guaranteeing jobs at the top of the skill sets. It's designed for the group that was defined as unemployable. So the long-term unemployed is designed to be the employer of last resort, right? So it's not a silver bullet to solving all of society's problem, but once we recognize the financial sovereignty of the state and its financial capabilities, then they can't tell us that we can't afford to invest in medical schools and training for nurses and educational, and we can't afford to pay nurses a decent wage. We can't afford to pay teachers a decent wage. So we start shifting the narrative. In terms of the job guarantee workers, even though the job guarantee would be available to a nurse who loses their job, right? But most likely a nurse will find another job very quickly. An engineer will find a job very quickly. An investment banker will find a job very quickly. But we're talking about the unemployment population that tends to get stuck throughout the business cycle at the bottom of the labor market. That's really where we can lift the minimum level of the minimum quality of life for everybody and guarantee a decent quality of life. It has to be dignified work too. So it's not just cleaning up the parks. If the robots are coming, maybe we should have the robots clean the parks so that, people can do dignified work, less precarious work, work that's more fulfilling, right? And the only way to do it is to lift up the skill levels and lift up this over time. So the job guarantee will open up the way for more robots to join us, right? And do the precarious work and have human beings do the dignified work.
So those who opt not to take the job. Well, as of right now, those individuals are not even classified as unemployed or inactive. They're just out of the labor force by choice. Right? Now, so that wouldn't be included in the job guarantee. But if you're referring to individuals who have
job seekers allowance, for example, as a minimum. At the moment.
Right, but those are for job seekers. Right? Those individuals will show up and ask for a job. But in the U.S., you hear this reference to a lot of, quote unquote, lazy people who just don't want to work, right? Which is mostly a myth, right? And we've seen this in the recent financial crisis and the aftermath of the crisis. But if you're talking about individuals who show up to work and then they happen to be a drug addict or alcoholic or have mental health issues and can't show up on time and they shouldn't be working, then one of the things that a lot of the job guarantee literature talks about is taking people as they are, where they are, and identifying what are the issues. And then you realize you have a public health issue because we treat drug addiction and alcohol addiction as a crime when it's a cry for help from a public health perspective. So investing in those resources, including job guarantee, counseling services, is extremely important. And there'll be less and less need for that over time, but at least in the beginning, it's got to be an important component. Because we can't just give up on people, and that's important.
And if you look at the Victorian age, in fact, right up to the 1930s and the Depression, you see people unemployed as it being put on them as a moral fault, a kind of something wrong with them,
Right.
that they're lazy, and that all of that has crept back into our discourse here in this country. It's not just in the States.
Yeah.
It's absolutely here. The idea of the shiftless, you know, that the poor person who gets up in the morning to go to work like a proper person should do, who walks down the street past the house of someone with their curtains closed because they don't bother getting up for work, because they just take the benefits and the handouts. You know, the welfare queen is alive and thriving here as an image, just as it is in the States, and it has been imported from there. And it's been a development, because if you look at all those ideas that were there in the Victorian and 30s, that they were eradicated. By the time I left school in 1973 and went into work, I went into a world of full employment.
Right.
And that idea had gone. People didn't talk about, in the 70s you didn't talk about people who were too idle to work, bone idle and all that. It was no longer part of the discourse, and it has been brought back by political activity, political decisions, and leadership from the top. So
and it's a narrative, and we should not accept that narrative. We should counter it with a different narrative that's plausible, that makes sense to the average person who's not tuned to all the history and all the politics and all the things, because for these ideas to take hold, it really needs to be a popular movement. So it's not going to be by people listening to me and trying to understand the three sector balances and trying to understand the buffer stock. It has to make sense to the average person on the street who doesn't really care about any of this, doesn't care about politics or anything. That's how a political narrative wins, is by, you know, identifying people's actual pains and anxieties and, you know, personal situations, and offering hope and offering solutions, offering something that makes sense at that level. And that's how you get a movement. That's how you get a social movement. It's important to have the academics and the politicians and the leaders, you know, have, you know, the other side of the debate. But the masses need to be on board with a new narrative. Yeah, the closest thing you get to people knowing that we can afford it is when it comes to military expenditures and wars. Because people realize nobody debated where the money came from, and nobody voted for this, and nobody borrowed any money. So how can we snap our fingers and get into, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of spending all of a sudden, when the night before everybody was saying we're broke, right? And lately I started using this war metaphor in the case of the US, because maybe it works in the case of the UK too, but in the case of the US, you go to the period of the Great Depression, where it was the most miserable period of in economic history for the US, and people know that, you know, from the average person knows how miserable the situation was, because they heard the stories from their parents and grandparents' generation. And then you go from the 30s of the Great Depression, millions of people unemployed, no resources, the government is broke, everybody's broke. And then World War II starts, and all of a sudden we're at full employment. Where did the money come from? And then people say, oh, it was the government debt went up a lot. Well, then you start pushing on that point and you say, well, so the US government did sell freedom bonds, right? They were marketed as freedom bonds to free Europe and all of that. But the freedom bonds were not sold before the war. They were sold after the war, or during the war, I should say. Which means the spending happened, spending money into existence. And then you couldn't tax, you know, the population during that time, but you could, you know, sell them a piece of paper to leverage their patriotism and love for freedom, and say, postpone your consumption until after the war. We need your cash. We're going to store it away. Because if those workers who were earning decent wages during the war boom in the United States, if they went on a shopping spree to buy new cars, new houses, there was a shortage of production. You know, all the U.S. auto manufacturers shut down production and shifted to military production. All the companies in Detroit became producers of military equipment. So if you had money, wanted to buy a new car, wanted to buy a new house, you'll be bidding up prices, you'll be causing inflation. So selling the war bonds, the freedom bonds, was not to finance the war. The war was already financed, it was underway. It was to withdraw the purchasing power, stabilize interest rates, stabilize inflation, and postpone that consumption until after the war, when the productive capacity goes back to normal, right? So I started this narrative in the last few weeks with different audiences, and it's clicking. People get it. So we can finance the war without having money. So we could finance this in the same way. And then you realize, well, the national debt wasn't really a burden back then, and it's not a burden right now. So why not? But then even when you start putting numbers on the table, but how much is this going to cost? Forget about MMT. And it's depending on how generous you want to be with the benefits and with the wages. Most estimates for the UK that I've seen are 1 to 2% of GDP. To produce permanent full employment and superior quality of life, and to save society not only the financial cost of unemployment and its negative consequences, but the social and emotional cost of unemployment for individuals and for society.
So supposing that you recruit a lot of people into care work through the job guarantee mechanism,
yep.
and then you go through a period when the economy is booming,
right.
And you describe the way that the job guarantee will,
sure.
that will
fluctuate.
But now you're dependent on these people to occupy those positions.
Very good point.
We
yep.
need
sure.
we need them in those. So how does that work with this sort of fluctuating?
That's a good problem to identify,
yeah.
right? The problem is here now, but it's hidden, right? And nobody cares for it because we think we can't afford it.
Yeah.
But once we realize that those additional care workers that we hired and trained and now are actually needed permanently,
yeah.
and that becomes mainline government employment, mainline responsibility of that society. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So many things.
Absolutely. So once we put a program in place, and we've seen it even in the case of Argentina, which was not a proper buffer stock program, which is one of the reasons why it was terminated, because community leaders who were part of the job guarantee program, they started their own organizations. We're talking about people who were socioeconomically excluded, in Argentina. But now they had community kitchens, they had community workshops, they had literacy programs that they created internally. But then they realized, well, we need a health clinic here. None of us can do this. The government's responsibility is to provide hospitals and health clinics to these. Why do they have it in the big city but not in our, informal settlements? So they protested and went to the Ministry of Health and said, we need health clinics here. So that became a political movement. It didn't start as a political movement. It was community organizers who got paid to do things for the community, so they did it. And then they realized, what's the next thing on our list? After literacy, after health, after food? They said healthcare. And we don't have the resources for this. We can't create it internally. So that became a public demand. And it was, a stain of shame on the right and the left in Argentina that they decided, well, these people are now a problem for us. There's 2 million of them, right, as part of the job guarantee at the time in Argentina. And now they're becoming a critical mass of political movement. So they decided to shut down the program, offer them a welfare check, a UBI of some sort, so that they stay politically inactive and not organized and break down that social fabric that was developing. So that's why I see the job guarantee as an essential feature of democracy. It's a participatory system. So the crisis started in 2000, 2001 when the employment program worked. And within a matter of less than a year, it employed 2 million people. And then quite a few of those 2 million people went back into the private sector when the private sector started booming. But then there was a core, the quote unquote unemployable. Because in the case of Argentina, it was also people in rural areas and people who were socioeconomically excluded for ethnic reasons too. And those groups started organizing demands for healthcare, and that became problematic for the country. So, but I wanted you to ask the next question after this. So what if we decide those are permanent jobs and we need those workers, and then the private sector needs to hire more? What do we do? How can the private sector, continue to grow without expanding labor pools? Well, there's two options. There's still something called immigration, and there's something called technological innovation, right? Technology displacing labor. It's not a new phenomenon. And if we invest more in education, research, and development, if companies invest more in research and development as opposed to speculating on financial markets, they can solve that problem. They're good at solving problems, but not on the backs of poor people, right? They have to invest their resources in research and development to be able to do more with fewer people. So we're not anti-technological development, we're not anti-robots, we're pro-robots when it comes to this. As long as we're producing a minimum decent quality of life for everybody, and then over time lifting that quality over time. Have the robots do the things that we can't do or that we shouldn't do, that no human being should do. And then move people up.
I'm a food policy student, so I was just reading about the SNAP program in the United States, food stamps.
Yeah.
And how the Trump administration wants to ship packages of food, of perishable food, non-perishable food, rather than have people buy it with their own money.
Yes.
Or buy fresh fruit and veg if they can
Yep.
swing it with that much amount of
Right.
money. So my question is, without that functioning democracy, or if there is a fraction of the population whose ideology is different,
Yeah.
couldn't this be a race to the bottom led by the government?
A race to the bottom in what sense? Like a job guarantee would be a race to the bottom?
Like they could be setting wages that are very low.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, lowering the minimum wage or offering a job guarantee at below minimum wage, which was the case in Argentina. Yeah, it will not function. You know, eventually it will self-destroy, right? And that's not something that anybody would advocate for, right? To pay people below minimum wage or to reduce, food subsidies. I mean, the reduction of food subsidies goes back to your point, because it's really the narrative that, if people have these welfare cards that they can use at the supermarket, maybe they'll buy something and sell it to their neighbor and end up buying drugs or alcohol. This is just the assumption that the poor are criminals, right? Because, and it's not, that's a long-standing narrative that goes back to the poor laws in this country and the enclosure movement. It was a crime to be unemployed. It was a crime to be poor. That's why there were poor houses. Or you get shipped to Australia, I guess, at some point. But that's connected to that same history, that we're by assumption the poor are people who refuse to work, who are lazy, who are criminals, and instead of giving them a decent, dignified resource to buy their own food from a supermarket, we're going to ship them boxes because we don't trust them with the food, right? So, so I don't know if I answered.
These narratives exist, and how do we change that?
By changing the narrative in the general public. We can't let a small group of politicians and thought leaders and the elite shape the narrative. And I think what's happening with the job guarantee discussion now is that the narrative is saying, yeah, everybody deserves $15 an hour. If we started the debate in the U.S. with let's raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, we would be fighting this for the next 20 years. But once people realize there's a job guarantee as a human right at a decent wage, which includes minimum wage, and by the way, it should include health care, which we couldn't get, through Obama, definitely not through Trump. Now all of a sudden, all of these big issues are on the table as one package, as a minimum standard for society. I see a couple of hands related to this, yeah.
I think America has gone a long way further down the route of privatisation and the exploitation of people and the increase of poverty and unemployment than the UK has.
Right.
And I do put the yes in. And very well part of direction of travel. But I wonder whether that is part of the reason why the JG ends up having a kind of appeal now in the discourse in America, in the political discourse, Sarah and I was discussing quietly there in the back that we worry it may not yet have in the UK. And that if you look at what happened historically, here, our big social welfare program started, our big changes happened after the Second World War, after 2 world wars in Europe, which absolutely decimated people, after as well in 1919, a massive flu epidemic, which literally decimated communities, left entire villages empty across Europe.
Right.
And which, where people felt themselves to have been abused by the depression and everything else. So it came from this incredibly low place as this kind of great sort of angry voice that rose up saying, we need something better, we deserve something better.
Absolutely.
And although you're saying that what happened with the investment then after that, during the sort of post-war periods, were very periodic and they weren't a buffer, they were just, they really were just periodic things. The mentality was still there that was a possibility at least, that was actually a reality that government could do that.
Right.
And when you're talking about the developing countries, you're talking about them coming from a low base and being able, talking about Argentina, about them coming from a low base and taking sort of steps up and therefore looking at how they can grow things. And I really worry here that what we're seeing is the destruction of that. We were at that high place and we're going down.
Right.
And people are saying, oh, the private sector can replace what the public sector does, but people need to start paying more from their own pockets.
Right.
And so I really, really fear that we're on a tumbling.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the reason why this is catching on in the U.S. is because things are extremely bad in the Rust Belt, in the Midwest, across the country. Inequality is extremely high. Child poverty is extremely high. Child mortality is on the rise in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world. It's unbelievable when you see these pockets of extreme wealth and pockets of extreme poverty across the street. Homelessness is on the rise. And the younger generation, the millennials, who are leaving university with tons of debt, unaffordable, they can't buy a house, they can't start a business, they still live in their parents' basement, and they're plugged into the gig economy, taking random jobs left and right, and they know from the data that their standard of living is guaranteed to be lower than their parents' generation. And their parents have no savings for their retirement, and they're counting on their kids to help them out. So the level of anxiety and anger. In addition, the younger generation, they have no recollection of the Cold War, don't really care about the Russians, they don't really care about the Soviet Union and the slippery slope to communism. They don't have that baggage, right, that their grandparents had and their parents' generation had. So when Bernie Sanders says socialism, they say, sure, yeah, why not? So it's a very different social and political context. But you're right about the UK. It's unfortunately, from what I see, it's going in that direction, unless there's a counter movement to avoid that trap. Yes, please. Yeah.
The other thing is, what excites me most really personally about the job guarantee is the freedom it can give people who are now trapped.
Right.
People that have problems that we don't necessarily see, people who are stuck,
Mm-hmm.
living with people they don't want to be with, who are potentially in danger, who
Right.
have no way out
Sure.
because they can't go anywhere, because they can't get a job,
Right.
so they're stuck. I see this as a freedom for them. People who are trapped in jobs where they're being mistreated by their employers and
Sure.
they can't find something else. I think it's a great method of social liberation for people.
Right, absolutely.
That's what we highlight most about it.
Absolutely.
Why do you think so many politicians are supporting and pushing for the austerity arguments? And what do you think their motives are? And why do they think it's a good idea to get rid of public services?
Good question. So it depends on the politicians and their motivation. So because the dominant narrative is of the kind that says we can't afford it, we have to reduce the debt and all that, a lot of politicians believe that if they say anything contrary to that, the average citizen will vote against them. Because they'll be perceived as irresponsible, financially irresponsible. But if we change the narrative so that the public understands, then they'll be more comfortable doing that. I know that for a fact with, a handful of U.S. Congress people who behind closed doors and high-ranking politicians behind closed doors, when they see MMT and understand it, say, yeah, that makes sense. And they say, I can't say that in public. I say, why not? Because I'll be eaten alive in the media by Fox News, by CNN, by the left, by the right, by my voters. I'll be voted out of office because it'll be portrayed as irresponsible. You should take economics 101. You should learn, by now you should know that, if you spend too much, you cause inflation. But then they say, if there's a critical mass of people in the public who understand this, critical mass of people in the media who understand this and can back it up, then I'll come out and say it. So we need that critical mass, and this is really what this movement is about building that critical mass of people in the media. In the US, there's quite a few, media venues that have written quite a bit about, and this is even before this week, about the job guarantee, and, Bloomberg News covered it, CNBC, even Fox News at some point a year ago interviewed one of our friends, Mark Paul, on the job guarantee with Tucker Carlson. He didn't really have anything bad to say about it. I was like, all right, that sounds interesting. So we have a little bit of that momentum. And once you have media figures who understand it and at least can argue about it, on both sides, you have critical mass of individuals who can confront politicians and say, you can't trick me with your austerity story because I know better. Then you'll find more politicians willing to come out and endorse it. And that's really... I'm sorry? The threat to public services is an extension of that way. Absolutely, because we can't afford it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That I think while the job guarantee is a fantastic, sort of elegant solution that deserves to be recognized, I think it might also have to somehow, on a global scale, incorporate a supranational approach to dealing with these offshore jurisdictions. Because there's like these are the known unknowns, basically, the unaccounted money. Money laundering,
Yeah, once again, the job guarantee can't deal with, as a program by itself, can't deal with all of these issues. It's not a silver bullet. But there's nothing stopping us from taxing offshore accounts and dealing with money laundering and dealing with these issues. But not to say that we need the money to fund the program,
exactly.
Right? So, right. But on maybe you're interested in the union type of thing, because I don't want you to hear this from me that I said this is, a better threat for workers. Well, if you're union workers, there's no reason for the job guarantee workers themselves not to be unionized and bargain for better workplace conditions and employment conditions. And so it's not necessarily an anti-union program per se.
In virtually, let's say, could impose even better standards.
Sure. They're saying what we as a society think of minimal standards for workplace conditions, safety conditions, wages and benefits. So this raises the standard. It's really not meant to be a race to the bottom. If anything, it's a race to the top.